Chapter 3. Maybe I will have that drink of water now, Lizzie said, reaching for her glass. I was only too pleased to hand it to her. I think you're tiring yourself, I told her. I am fine, she replied firmly. Quite fine. Just a dry throat, that is all. What about the elephant? Carl asked her. You haven't told us about the elephant yet. Patience, patience, Lizzie said, laughing. You are just like Carly, just like him. Questions, always questions. The likeness between you is, how do you say it? Uncanny. I was just coming to that part of the story. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes before she went on. This was about the time Muddy went to work in the zoo with the elephants. With so many men away at the war, the women were doing more and more of the men's work these days. And anyway, now that Poppy was gone, I suppose we must have needed the money. Poppy came home every few months on leave, but each time he seemed to me to be more and more changed, a different man almost. He was thinner in the face with dark rings under his sunken eyes. He would be sitting in his chair, Carly on his knee, and hardly saying a word. We never went boating together. Poppy didn't go fishing. He did not even listen to his beloved Bash on the gramophone. And he never laughed, not even at Carly's tricks and antics. Then as the war dragged on, year after year, Poppy came home less and less. We heard he was in Russia somewhere, but we never knew exactly where. We had letters, of course, but not that often. Whenever a new one did come, Muddy would read it out loud to Carly and me every evening before bedtime. We would have then what Muddy always called a family moment, together, holding hands around the kitchen table and closing our eyes to think of Poppy. Then she would put the letters up with all the others on the mantelpiece, behind the photo of Poppy in his uniform. The mantelpiece became like an altar to his memory. Carly would often ask us if Poppy was dead in the war. Of course not, we told him. Poppy was fine. He would be home soon, we told him. We told him anything to keep him happy, that it would all be better before we knew it, and everything would be back to the way it had been. But as the war went on, hiding the truth was becoming impossible. The news worsened with every passing week. Food became scarce. More and more cities were being bombed all over Germany. We had more and more days off school because there was not enough coal anymore to heat the classrooms. The Russian army, the Red Army we called it, was closing in on us from the east. Refugees were flooding into Dresden, and the Allies, the Americans, and the British, were already marching into Germany from the west. More and more husbands and sons and brothers were being reported dead or missing. It was common now, every week, for one of our school friends to learn the dreadful news that their father or brother was not coming home. So of course Muddy and I began to fear the worst for Poppy. We both feared it, I know we did, but did not dare speak of it. We used to listen to the radio every morning, Muddy and I. All through the war we had done this, listening for news from the particular battlefront where we thought Poppy was fighting. They still tried to make bad news sound like good news. They were very good at that. But no matter what they told us, we knew, as everyone did by now, that the war was lost, that it was only a question of how quickly it would end, and of who would get to us first, the Red Army from the east or the Allies from the west. We all hoped it might be the Allies. From the refugees, we had heard such terrible things about the Red Army. In the end, it was just too painful to listen to any more on the radio, so we didn't. We listened to the gramophone instead, and longed every day for the war to be over, for Poppy to be home again with us. Every night before we went up to bed, Muddy would make sure that Carly and I said goodnight to Poppy's photo. Carly liked to touch it with his fingertips. I had to lift him up because he was still too small to reach it himself. I think I was often angry in those days, with the way the world was, and I am ashamed to say that sometimes I took it out on Muddy, blaming her for just about everything. I have no excuse for this, except that I was 15 and felt that day by day all my happiness was being taken from me. I felt hollow inside, empty and angry. It is difficult to explain, but I felt as if I were all alone in the world, in a world I used to love, and that I had come to hate. More and more I felt apart from everyone and everything, from my friends and family even, as if I no longer belonged. Like Poppy, I could no longer even take pleasure in Carly's playfulness. He went on joking and juggling just the same, with the world falling apart about us. I became more and more irritated with him, and with Muddy too. Muddy could see this, I think, and became all the more maternal and attentive towards me, which only made things worse, of course. We did not live far from the zoo where Muddy worked, so that in the dark of the evening, if I went out into the garden, I could hear the lions roaring and the monkeys chattering and the wolves howling. I had taken to getting out of the house whenever I could. However cold it was, I would sit on the swing and listen to them. I would close my eyes and try to imagine myself out in the jungle away from everything that was going on, far from the war and all of this unhappiness. One evening, Muddy came out to join me, bringing me my coat. "You'll catch your death, Elizabeth," she said, wrapping the coat around my shoulders. She began to tell me all about the animals we were hearing, their names, the country they had come from, their personalities, who was friends with who, and their funny habits. And then she started talking about Marlene again, the young elephant that she had almost adopted by now. I just didn't want to hear all about Marlene. Muddy was talking on and on about her with such deep affection, almost as if she really were a part of the family. It occurred to me then, quite suddenly, that maybe this elephant was more precious to her than Carly and I. It was some years now since Marlene had been born, 4 or 5 maybe. Muddy had been there at the birth, and she was so proud of that, and prouder still when her director at the zoo said that since she was the one who saw her come into the world, then she should be the one to name her. After that, it was almost as if Marlene were her baby. And in that last few days in particular, she had been talking about her all the time because she was very worried about her. Only a month or 2 before this, Marlene's mother had become sick, and she had died quite suddenly. So Muddy would be home late each evening, spending even longer hours at the zoo, just to be with Marlene, to comfort her. Elephants grieve just like we do. Muddy had often explained this to us. She told us that Marlene needed her to be there with her just as much as possible, that she had been off her food and depressed ever since her mother had died. And now there was a photo on the mantelpiece of them both together, Muddy stroking Marlene's ear. It was right next to the photograph of Poppy and his letters, and I didn't like that at all. Muddy had taken Carly and me with her into the zoo to see Marlene many times. It was true, she did seem sad and dejected. And Muddy was right, she was the sweetest elephant in the world, so gentle. She had such kind eyes. Her trunk seemed to have a life all of its own, and she rumbled and groaned almost as if she were talking, which always made Carly giggle. And whenever he giggled, that seemed to cheer Marlene up a lot. Carly and that elephant became the best of friends. It was the highlight of Carly's life when Muddy took us to see Marlene. They were so alike, those two, Marlene and Carly, I mean. Naughty, inquisitive, funny. Carly would talk to her as he fed her, and he led her about by her trunk. Like the best of friends, the best of soulmates they were. If I am honest, I think I was a little jealous, and maybe this is why I was heartily sick of hearing Muddy going on and on about her confused elephant. And here she was doing it again. "Do you hear that, Elizabeth?" she said, grasping my arm. "It is Marlene. I am sure that is Marlene, trumpeting again. She hates to hear the wolves howling. I've told her that they won't harm her, but she is all alone at night when I am not there, and she gets frightened. Do you hear her?" For goodness sake, Muddy. Even as I was shouting at her, I knew I shouldn't be, but I couldn't stop myself. There is a war going on, Muddy, or hadn't you noticed? Puppy is away fighting. He's probably lying there dead in the snow in Russia right now. In the city, there are thousands of people starving in the streets, and all you can talk about is your precious Marlene. She's just an elephant, a stupid elephant. Muddy turned on me then. And if I talk about the war, will it bring Poppy home? Will it? Will the bombing stop? Will the Russians and the Americans turn around and go home? I do not think so, Elizabeth. We are losing this war, and do you know what? I don't care. What can I do about it? Why should I talk about it? How can I help? All I can do is look after my children and look after my animals, and I will do both, to my dying breath. To Marlene, I talk about you and Carly. To you, I talk about Marlene. Is that so terrible? I have never seen her like this, and at once regretted my cruel words. We cried then and clung to one another in the dark of the garden. It is strange how a moment like that can change things around. Until then, I had simply been her child, her daughter, and she my mother. Until then, we had confided in one another very little. Suddenly, we were opening our hearts to each other. This was when she told me that that it was that had been troubling her so much. For weeks now I have not been sleeping at nights, and do you know why this is, Elizabeth? She said. It is because I should be worrying about Poppy and you and little Carly, and I do, but not enough, and this makes me feel so bad. There is always something else I am thinking about because it is terrible, so terrible, that I cannot put it out of my mind. What, Muddy? What? I asked her. She led me away from the house then, to the garden bench that set against the back wall, the bench where she and Poppy always used to sit on summer evenings when they wanted to be alone. Carly and I used to watch them from our bedroom window and always wonder what they were saying. Sometimes, I remember, little Carly would pretend to smoke, mimicking everything that Poppy did, until he had us both in fits of laughter. I think it was the first time I had ever sat there on this bench with Muddy. I was in Poppy's place, and it felt very special. Muddy held my hand tight as she talked to me. The herd director at the zoo, Elizabeth, he called us in together, all the keepers, everyone. This was a month or 2 ago. He told us he had something very serious to tell us. Until now, he said, Dresden has not been bombed. Almost all the big city in Germany lie in ruins. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, thousands upon thousands are dead. Only Dresden has been spared. But sooner or later, he told us, the bombers are sure to come, and so we have to plan for this. So far, we have been very lucky, but our luck cannot last forever. Why should Dresden be special? When the bombers do come, we are well prepared. We all have basements or shelters to go to, and they are deep, so deep that many of us will have a good chance to survive. We know where to go. We have all done our air raid drill. But the animals, he said, have nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. If the zoo is hit by the bombs, and in raid, this is very likely, then it is possible that many of the animals might escape from their cages and find their way into the city. The authorities say this cannot be allowed to happen. What will they do to the animals then? I asked her. Will they take them away to somewhere safe? I am afraid not, Muddy replied. The herd director told us that very regrettably it has been decided that we must destroy most of the animals, especially the big carnivores like lions and tigers and bears, and also the elephants. Any animal that might be a threat to the people in the city. I know this is a dreadful thing to have to do, he told us, but if the worst comes to worst and the bombers do come, then we shall just have to do it. We have no choice. We should prepare ourselves. That is what the herd director said, Elizabeth. She cried, almost in tears by now. To prepare ourselves. How can I prepare myself to stand by and watch them shoot Marlene? Tell me that. I cannot bear the thought of it, Elizabeth. I just cannot. And will the bombers come, Muddy? I asked her. She did not reply at once. I am afraid so, Elizabeth, she said. If I am honest, and I think you are old enough for me to be honest with you, I can see no reason why they should not come. Sooner or later, they must come. We all know this. I think I had never been so frightened in all my life as I was in that moment. Muddy tried to comfort me all she could. I should not have told you. I should not, she whispered, holding me close. But do not worry. Whatever happens, I shall look after you and little Carly. The air raid sirens will give us plenty of warning, and the shelter is very near, isn't it? And it is so deep that the bombs cannot reach us down there. We have practiced it so many times. We shall survive this, I promise you. You, me, and little Carly. They can send all the bombers they like, and we will survive. And I make you another promise, Elizabeth. I shall make sure that also Marlene survives with us. I will not let this war take from me all those that I love. She wiped away my tears then, and she held me at arm's length, brushing the hair from my eyes. Believe me, all will be well, Elizabeth. Now let us go inside and say our good nights to Poppy. So that is what we did. In the morning, all three of us found ourselves together in Muddy's bed. Muddy said she had slept better that night than for a very long time. At breakfast, she told us that from now on, that is how she would like all of us to sleep, together. She was happier than I'd seen her in ages, and so was I. As we left the house that morning, she kissed me goodbye and then whispered something in my ear as she hugged me. I have an idea, Elizabeth. In the night, a wonderful idea, a grand idea, a secret. What? I asked. But she would not say any more. On the way to school with Carly that day, I heard the sudden throbbing drone of planes overhead. I felt a warm shiver of fear crawling up my back. Then Carly was leaping up and down and waving wildly. "They're ours," he cried. "They're ours!" And they were too, this time.